So we'll look at this tripartite structure of the sacraments kind of rapidly. It's a bit of a technical distinction, of course. It must be if it's in Latin. It grows out of the character, actually. It grows out of Augustine's notion of the character, that there's this middle term in the sacraments. And so theologians later took on this language of character, of this middle term, and said, is there a structure to all the sacraments that reflects this middle term, these three elements? So let's look at this. The first element of a sacrament is called the sacramentum tantum. That is the sign alone, the sacrament itself. This is the outward sign of the sacrament. This is what we looked at with matter and form. So the sacramentum tantum of baptism is the pouring of water with the Trinitarian formula. The sacramentum tantum of the Eucharist is bread and wine and the words of consecration. The sacramentum tantum of marriage is the exchange of vows, etc. Right? This is the outward sign. We should be rather familiar with this. That leads to ultimately the res tantum. In Latin, res means thing or reality. You'll remember this if you remember all the way back to Augustine. He was the one who gave us in sacraments the distinction between signum and res. This is basically the same thing, sign and reality. Remember, for Augustine, to really be a sacrament, you had to have an outward sign, signum, of an inward invisible reality, res. So the res tantum is the final effect of the sacrament, what it's all aimed at. This is the reality that the sacramental sign signifies, and it's ultimately sacramental grace, right? So for baptism, the res tantum, the final thing is the grace of justification. In let's take it's a clear one. Baptism, the Eucharist. The ultimate reality, Thomas says, is ecclesial union, right? The union in grace and love of the whole church with Christ. That's the res tantum, the final purpose of it all. So again, you have this pairing that we should be familiar with of the sign and the reality. But here's where Augustine came in and said, well, but in some sacraments, at least, there's this middle term, the character. We saw that in baptism, and we'll see that in the Middle Ages. This is applied to the structure of the Eucharist, actually, next, because think of the Eucharist, besides the sacramentum tantum, besides bread and wine, and besides the res tantum, the ultimate grace received, this union with Christ and one another in the church, there's something else there. There's the real presence. So when you look at this, it seems that there's a third element to the structure of a sacrament, and this is what we call the res et sacramentum. It's both a reality, res, and a sign, sacramentum. So it is a middle term between these first two. As far as the sacramentum tantum goes, the outward sign, in relation to that, this is a res. This is an effect. This is a thing. It's a reality. So the outward sign of water and the pouring of water in the Trinitarian formula, that outward sign has the effect, brings about the reality of the sacramental character in baptism. However, that sacramental character in baptism is also a sign, sacramentum, of a further reality. The final reality, the res tantum. So if we had a chart here, it would be the res et sacramentum is an effect of the outward sign, but it's also a cause of the final grace, the final reality. It's this middle term. So that's why it's res et and sacramentum, sign. So it's a reality signified, which is also a sign and cause of a further or final effect. That is the res tantum. We saw in baptism, confirmation, and holy orders, this res et sacramentum is the sacramental character. We saw that. In the Eucharist, this res et sacramentum is the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. In marriage, it's the indissoluble bond. It's a reality that is formed that contributes to the final grace given, that sacramental grace. Now, in reconciliation and anointing of the sick, it's less clear. And our author takes a stab at it, and authors are not This has never been defined by the church. Authors are divided on exactly what this is. One of the critiques of the medieval schema like this is that it's actually artificial. And so, sure, we might say that some sacraments have these middle terms, the character, the real presence, the indissoluble bond. But do we really need, is it necessary, is it fitting, is it right to impose this structure on all three sacraments? So authors are somewhat, they dispute what, if anything, is this res et sacramentum of the other two sacraments. And that will bring us, and I suppose I should note, why is this important? It shows the full flowering of the totality of the sacraments. Whether or not you use the language here, it's important to realize, for instance, in the Eucharist, that the real presence, for all it is, and its centrality, is for a further purpose. It exists, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist exists for the res tantum, to bring the church into union with Christ, right? It's to say that the indissoluble bond of marriage is a reality. It's a thing that exists. It's not just a subjective or external rule, right? So these elements of the sacraments, if they're real, have effects and realities that we need to know about. So that will bring us to the last video for this week, which is the institution of the sacraments.